Shadows drive down on terror through the eyes of candlelight. Someone please go call for the Emperor. Valdor is in charge. Thunder warriors, we mourn you, buried in the snow. Wraight's come to tell us everything he knows. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I am so happy and excited. I've got the amazing Wraight here today. Have I pronounced your name right?
You have. That's very good. Doesn't happen
Wonderful.
often.
And I've been reading the magnificent Valdor. Yes, which is out of order of my normal reading material because I'm going through the Heresy and Gaunts, and this was an exception, Chris, that I got to read because I'm really in love with all the Primarch stories and the basically all the stuff about the Emperor. I'm a bit of an Emperor fangirl. So my friend Ian very kindly said, let's get this in. And I have another friend called Jim who just feeds me books. They just keep arriving in my mailbox. But yeah, so this was a long time ago that you wrote Valdor. Do you remember?
It was. Yeah, it was years ago. I was trying to remember, actually. It feels like a lot. I was trying to remember what I wrote for a start.
I can remind you. So it's first published in 2019.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and its subtitle is Birth of the Imperium.
Yeah.
Which is great. But let's talk about the birth of your kind of connection with Warhammer and the hobby, because I looked on Goodreads, which is my favorite author app, and it said you've got 156 individual pieces of work. And
really?
I mean, I guess that means it's different editions and things, but then I was scrolling through your pages and there's so much Warhammer, like books and books and books, and there's even a Stargate Atlantis thing going on. So could you tell me a little bit about, let's start from the beginning. How and when did you know that you were going to be a writer?
Wow. So it's been a long time. It's been years and years thinking back. And so I've done different things before. And I think I wanted to try out writing for a long time. Always enjoyed reading. I guess I think we're thinking about 15 years ago now, started exploring writing partly for fun and then more seriously thinking, is there a way to turn this into some kind of career? And at the time, I think they still do it, Black Library had an open submissions window every so often, so they'd ask for short stories. I think I pitched a few things beforehand and they hadn't got anywhere, they weren't quite right. It's a very hard setting, Warhammer. If you're new to it, there's a lot to learn. It's not like a lot of other science fiction or fantasy settings, so it's a lot to get your head around. So I'd had a few goes and wasn't successful, but then there was an open submissions thing for Warhammer Fantasy, which at the time was the other sort of line that Black Library was doing, and I managed to get a short story into an anthology called Invasion, which is long out of print, about high elves, which was my
Are you an elf person?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I probably am. I've written. I wrote another elf story for Warhammer Fantasy for the War of the Beard, or the War of Vengeance, which is a big thing in the old lore. And I did enjoy writing the elves, and I was writing with Nick Kime, who's definitely a dwarf guy, and some interesting conversation about that one. But no, I mean, I think so. The idea of the short story was that it was high elves kind of discovering the old world and seeing these before the empire and the empire of the humans kind of became a thing, and noticing that these sort of savages living in the trees that they were sort of a bit sort of dismissive of, but then knowing that in the future they'd become. So it was all that kind of the origin. So in some ways it's very similar to Valdor, this idea that you're looking right at the beginnings of things that will become very powerful and very interesting. So those kind of things, I guess, always interest me. If you're looking at established fantasy settings, how did they start? What are the things that are really interesting about them? So anyway, that did find its way into the anthology. And after that, I started talking to Lindsay Priestley, who was an editor at Black Library at the time, and she started to invite me to pitch for novels. And originally, it was really Warhammer Fantasy. I wrote about 3 or 4 fantasy books. And then after that, they sort of, kind of feel my way into the setting. I was learning a lot about Warhammer. I'm not a big gamer. I've come across it in the past, but at that time I wasn't sort of a huge expert on the settings. A lot to learn. There's a lot of complexity about it, as you know.
As I'm listening.
Yeah. And eventually, after I think it's about 3 books, Nick Kine, who until very recently was the managing editor at Black Library, asked if I'd like to try out for writing 40k, which was
Mm.
another big step up. I started writing Space Wolves, Imperial Guard, and started. So then for a few years, I was writing a fantasy book followed by a 40k book, and then going back to fantasy and switching between the two.
Yeah.
But as time went on, I sort of ended up being a 40k writer,
Mm.
and then it's sort of every time I stopped writing a book, they asked me for another one, so that just kept on going until today, really, where I'm writing full time, which is a nice position to be in. I enjoy it a lot, and really writing for that library and sort of doing a lot of things in Heresy, a lot of things in 40k, and that's where I've ended up.
Yeah, I mean, that is wonderful. That is, I think so many people watching this, probably their dream job would be just to write for the Black Library. So it's really good to hear from someone who has gone through the submissions route and found this lovely success.
Yeah, and it's great they do it, and I think they still do open submissions window. And I mean, in the old days, we used to do a lot more kind of events and things where we'd meet sort of fans and meet people in the community. And
Yeah.
what's been really lovely is that over the years, a few people that I remember chatting to at things like the Black Library Weekend have then gone on to get short story plays and then novels. And so it is a route into writing even now. And I think when these things come up, it's if you have got an interest in writing, it's a genuine shot. They are very keen on getting new talent in, new ideas,
Mm.
and there's more than one regular author who started out through that route. So it's definitely still there. It's definitely still possible.
Amazing. Yes. So this is encouragement for anyone watching. Just do it and
Yeah.
submit. And what was your connection? Because as you say, Warhammer is such a complex franchise. Someone
Mm,
even made me a special magnetized board game so I could learn Primarch names, legions, and what they were known for.
yeah.
Like, so what was it that attracted you, or how did you kind of get a whiff of the hobby and then decide that you were going to have a look at it?
So I've always known about Warhammer. So when I was a lot younger, I used to play at school a little bit, and certainly read the Old White Dwarfs and even some of the novels. Like there's a very early trilogy called the Inquisitor novels, which was written I think in the 80s by Ian Watson, which I remember loving when I was a teenager. It's an absolutely mad view of Warhammer. I think a lot's changed since they wrote them, but it's got the real old school kind of grim dark vibe. It's brilliantly imaginative and inventive, and so I've always known about it, and particularly the artwork. I remember sort of leafing through the Old White Dwarfs and
Mm.
some of the John Blanche stuff and Adrian
Yeah,
Smith. It's just amazing. So I've always been aware and always enjoyed this kind of the aesthetic, and it is a really unique franchise. There's not very much like it. I think when it's done right, or certainly in kind of the ways that I enjoy, I think it's like nothing else. It's not like Star Wars. It's not like Star Trek, which were
yeah,
the other big sort of franchises when I was growing up. It's very British, which I think is an interesting thing. It's got that kind of everything's rubbish kind
yeah.
of aesthetic, which appeals to I think a lot of Brits. So I guess I'd always had it in the background and had read some of the stuff. But then once I was invited to get back into it, there's so much to discover, and it is a long process, but it's really enjoyable. I still love reading Warhammer. There's a lot being produced every year. There's always a lot to get your head around. I'm always being sent stuff by that library saying you need to know this because this has changed everything. And so it's just an ongoing journey, and it's really daunting, I think, because it's so big. And I think
Yeah.
you're reading the Heresy series, which is 54 books or something like that. And that's just that's a lifetime's
I
supply.
know, right? That's my next 5 years.
Yeah.
So I
But
think I'm up to I'm
I think what
7
a lot
or
of
8
people
at the
do is
moment.
they find the bits that interest them. They find the corners of the setting that interest them. It might be a faction they like, or it might be a certain writer or certain set background ideas. And I think that's a sensible way to do it. Just find the bits that you like and gradually explore.
Hmm.
And don't get overwhelmed with I've got to read these books or I won't understand it properly because
Yeah.
no one's read them all and no one understands it properly. We're all kind of feeling our way and trying to make sense of it.
So good to know. And do you get to, I mean, I often hear authors talking about the Black Library events. I'm
Mm.
so gutted that those don't happen anymore. I think they'd be brilliant.
Yeah.
For nerdy readers like me, I would love them. Do you get much opportunity to chat or kind of work with other Black Library writers and say things
Yeah.
like, okay, I'm going to do this, just so you know, I'm going to put this little thing in and it might impact you, or do you have to work like in little solo pods? How does that work?
So no, there's quite a lot of chat, particularly about the joint author series. So the Heresy is a big one, but there
Yeah.
have been other things. We recently did the Siege of Terror, which is the sort of the
Mm.
capstone on the whole here. There was a lot of schedule. We used to, in the days, well, we used to meet in person a lot, and that sort of has changed a little bit recently, but we're hopefully moving back to that. But no, there's an awful lot of to and fro between
Yeah.
between all of us, and some of it's informal. Sometimes you might want to use a character that someone else created. So there's this sort of this slight difference, but there's characters that have always been part of the setting. They're in the codexes, they're in the game, and they're sort of they occupy a certain position. But then it might be that Guy Haley or Aaron Dembski-Bowden invented some for one of their stories that you suddenly think, wow, that would be great if I could do something with them. So we'll chat and they'll say no or yes or don't kill them or something like that.
Yeah, don't kill them.
Yeah, well, that's important because
Yes.
could really ruin someone's plans. But no, and I think it was nice in the past when we did things like the big events because we'd meet each other and we'd meet because otherwise it's quite a sort of remote way of making a living. But we'd also meet a lot of the readers who were keen to chat, and that was really, really nice. I think you were saying about sort of meeting people in the hobby and finding that they're all really nice, and that's absolutely true across the board. I think, particularly at the live events. And it's good for writers to sort of see people enthusiastic about what you do, because otherwise you can just sort of rely on the internet, which is not a great source of information.
Oh yeah. The internet is horrible.
Well, it can be.
Yeah. I mean, when I started my YouTube channel, my friend Ian gave me some suggestions of words to filter out in the comments and things, and I think just stick with the goodies on the internet. There are lots of goodies out there, but yeah. I just to be topical, I recently I took a break over last week. There are 2 or 3 days I just stayed off the internet because quite a lot of people were very angry about female custodes.
Oh, right.
And I just thought I just go and touch some grass and have some chocolate and watch some reality TV. But I agree with you. Generally, people are really lovely to talk. They really love talking about this universe and.
Yeah.
The writers I've spoken to, are so generous with their time. This is probably eating into your word hours. So, yeah, very grateful.
Well, I think you've got to remember that for us, talking to people who are enthusiastic about what we do is just amazing, because otherwise you could easily imagine that these things never get read.
They do.
They sort of go out into the void. And so it is nice to chat about these things, because I think it's, any hobby and any kind of thing that lots of people like doing is a social thing. People have strong feelings about the setting, and that's great most of the time. I think it's good, even when there might be opinions that you don't necessarily agree with, or there's controversy. It's what we do, isn't it? We chat about it because we care about it, and the way it goes. And so actually having these kind of exchanges, and like we were saying, the live events were great for that, because you've got the idea that this was a living community. And that you were feeding into that, and that's it's a privilege. It sounds a bit sort of pretentious to say, but it is a privilege to be able to feed into something that's been around since the 80s and kind of contribute to it.
Yeah, so cool. Well, let's hope that they may one day bring back a Black Library event. That would be so fun.
It would be great, wouldn't it? Yeah.
You never know. We need to start a letter writing campaign and be those annoying people. But let's talk about Valdor, which as I said, I really, really loved. I'm a huge Emperor fangirl, and he appears and we learn things about him in this, which is really, really exciting. But we start, and this is really thrilling for me. I love an origin story. If I'm ever reading about a superhero or anything, I love the origin story. So we start in basically Terra before the Emperor's tidied it all up and made it all lovely. And we meet our lovely heroine. And the beginning of the book really reminded me of one of my favorite sci-fi books. It's Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler.
Right.
Just the way Kandawire experiences growing up in these settlements where you're lucky if you have food, and society and civilization's kind of crumbling a bit, and recognizing things from our world before it all goes space marine-y. And just spotting little things like the name of Albion, or recognizing places around the world. So I mean, was that really exciting to get to write in this setting?
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think it's I'm guessing it's a sort of one-off opportunity, really. I don't think there'll be a lot of books set in this particular setting. I think that's probably right, actually. I think exactly what you say about origin stories. You wouldn't want to have lots and lots of them and really kind of take all the mystery away about how
Mm.
things. But it's really nice sometimes to have a glimpse into how things were. So I think now and again there'll be books like this that will sort of shine a light on this little bit of obscure history. Um, and no, it was amazing to start thinking about what the setting would have been like. That it's enormous change, the period that Valdor's set in. So it's the end of the sort of age of unification where Terra was being conquered by the Emperor, and it was turning into the Imperium. It became the Imperium slightly later. Well, I think the Imperium exists, but it's a very different Imperium to the one
Yeah.
we're used to. And so there was some stuff in the background about what things were like then. There were some names, there were some places, there were some events.
Mm.
There's an awful lot that wasn't clear and that wasn't sort of laid in stone. So there's opportunities to think about, well, what must have been happening then? What kind of forces would be emerging? What were people talking about and thinking about? They wouldn't
Mm.
have any expectation that 40k would happen in the way that it did. They wouldn't even have any expectation the heresy would, even though it was just around the corner in terms of sort of the timeline. So they'd be in this kind of, they'd be aware that everything's changing, but they wouldn't be aware of what the destination would be at all.
Mm.
And that's just an amazing opportunity as a writer. Really amazing. I think at the time I was quite conscious. This is a really lucky thing to be able to write about. I'm pleased to do it. Better not get it wrong. And I suppose lots of the difficulty was trying to be as careful as I could about not getting stuff wrong in terms of what was already known about. So, and actually, it was complicated because at the time, lots of other books were being written. Forge World were writing a series of books, which were really the definitive account of the heresy, and they hadn't all been written at that point. So some of the details have changed slightly since then, but they were sort of coming out alongside it. So I was really trying to kind of keep up with the moving target in some ways.
Wow.
So I think those were all difficult things, but they're really interesting things, and trying to sort of nail the tone as well about what would this place be like. It wouldn't be like 40k Imperium, we know that. It wouldn't be that kind of very bleak dystopian where everything had gone wrong. But what would it be just like a paradise? I think it's very unlikely. Nothing's really like that in the Warhammer universe. If it was not a paradise, how would it be, kind of different to the 40k universe? What would its failures be? What would its successes be? And I just find a lot of stuff so fascinating. It's such an amazing opportunity to world build and kind of think about how that would work. So it was a good opportunity.
I thought I loved it so much. It felt so different from anything that we kind of read before, because it was a mystery, and like seeing this setup, it like just kind of zoomed you in, and I just felt it felt really real. And you can imagine that kind of thing happening, like various warlord factions just bashing the crap out of each other. And there was, I'm going to forget this now, but Kandawire's dad said, when the workers are in charge, everything's fine. When the soldiers are in charge, nothing works. And you see that. And I also loved Kandawire's optimism that the emperor is going to come along and we're going to have law and order. So I've got to go and tell off this guy, because clearly this is not what the emperor would have wanted. And I love that kind of Warhammer irony.
Yeah.
When someone thinks, oh, and in this moment, the Imperium are looking like a way forward to civilization.
Yeah.
And there's just this thing like, maybe it was a mistake that they did this massacre, maybe, but we're going to go and deal with it in a lawful way and bring all that kind of hopefulness. We're going to bring Valdor to justice. I thought it was a really interesting kind of like microcosm of what would happen later with everything.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'm glad, because that's exactly what I was going for, the idea that there's lots of different people with different ideas about how things should go. And one of the things I really love about Warhammer is that nobody's ever right, but very few people are entirely wrong either. They've always got a perspective on a very complicated galaxy. And so there's a sense in which, on the one hand, we sympathise with the key character who really wants everything done by the book and has got quite an idealistic notion of how things ought to run. And for a lot of time, you think, oh, I hope she's right. I hope that's how it does go. But on the other hand, it's not clear that she is right, because what she doesn't know, what the Emperor doesn't know, is the background to all of this. He doesn't know quite what the threats are for the Imperium, and doesn't really know where all this stuff's come from. She doesn't really have the galaxy-wide kind of perspective that people like Valdor do. And so there's a whole nagging feeling like, well, although we wanted her to be right about this, maybe it could never have been that way. Maybe it's maybe, is it idealistic and wrong, or would it have been better? And I think having that kind of doubt about the whole thing is really important. Otherwise, we're just sort of saying, well, that's definitely the way it should have gone. This is definitely the way it shouldn't have gone. Whereas, my hope with the book is that we'd have lots of different characters, and that we wouldn't be able to kind of write off any of their points of view entirely.
Yeah, no, I mean, it felt very human. Like there were so many characters with different stakes in the game, and I have learned now. I've learned now not to get too hopeful, because quite often you did meet these you meet these amazing characters, and you're like on their side, and then they get smote at the end, or they get tricked.
Yeah.
And terrible things happen to them. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm really keen to ask this question right at the end. Sorry, I sometimes I get overexcited, and I need to know now that I have you hit. At the end, Kandawar is spared by Valdor, and I was like, "Wowie zowie, this never happens." I was so like emotive. I was like, because the minute she realizes, oh, the coup has failed, I literally was like, "Okay, steel yourself," because
Yeah.
and Valdor let her go free, and I wondered. What was the decision around that? Was that just to bring a ray of sunshine, or?
Mm. I'm going to have to really think hard about what I was thinking at the time. I mean, I think from memory, and this, you might be able to contradict me here, having read it more recently. I think the idea is that essentially custodians are bodyguards, and their primary function is to protect the emperor. They are an extension of the emperor's will. They're almost an extension of him in a strange kind of way. And I think we've written about custodians in 40k in a similar way, that once something stops being a threat to the emperor and a threat to the emperor's plan, in a way it stops existing for them.
Wow.
They're not mindlessly cruel. They don't go after. They don't have their own vendettas. They don't have their own projects. They exist to protect the emperor, and they're sort of very narrow vision of what the Imperium is. And once something moves out of that circle, if it stops being a threat or it disappears, it's someone else to worry about. And so I guess my gut feeling, and there's probably loads in the book that contradicts this, but trying to remember, I think that for Valdor, it's just that she's stopped being of interest to him.
Yeah.
He wouldn't spend a lot of time or energy either killing her or getting rid of her. If he makes the decision, well, she did something that I don't agree with, so it had to be stopped. But now it's been stopped, fine.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think that's the way they think about a lot of things, and that their remit is incredibly narrow, in the way that Space Marine's remit is not quite as narrow.
Yeah.
And when you get to 40k, or thousands of years later, they've almost taken that to absurd lengths, and they start to become, it almost becomes a little bit irrational. But at this point, I think it's just Valdor saying, okay, threat removed, move on.
Yeah.
And maybe, I don't know, this guy, maybe he also does quite like it, and he's quite impressed by her, and thinks, well, you were a worthy adversary, and they also do have a sort of this kind of honor kind of relationship as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I thought it was a really lovely coda to the book. All this seismic stuff happens, so much happens, and she quietly goes back to her place of origin. So you have this beautiful full story circle, which I really loved. I love that, seeing those little patterns in the writing. It makes me feel, because I argue all the time about the literary qualities of these books. Yes, we write around an IP, but the authors behind them obviously also have this kind of wealth of talent that goes into them. So I love little things like the ending at the beginning of the journey and stuff like this. And and it's interesting about Valdor and how human he is when he treats her at the end, because he's observing. There's a conversation with him and Malcador at the end of the book where they're saying, oh, the Emperor's showing a bit of humanity, and you're not quite sure if they're happy about that or displeased about that. So that kind of
this is one of the most intriguing bits about this part of the setting, but the whole of the setting is, what is the Emperor? What's the Emperor like? Why does the Emperor do what he does? And there's this long sort of this motif that pops up in a lot of the heresy books about, is the Emperor in any way human that we can recognize? Does he have kind of affection for his primarchs, for his legions, for their species, or has he become, or do you have to lose that in some way in order to be an effective protector of the species? Because he's up against these basically gods, these forces that are beyond some mortal understanding. In order to fight that, do you have to become like them, or can you retain a bit of the things that? And again, I suppose that's the theme of the book, really, because the contrast between someone like Valdor, who gives up an awful lot in order to do his job.
Yeah.
He doesn't have a lot of things, and he's aware that he's lost an awful lot as well. He sort of knows from time to time, I can't be like ordinary people.
Mm.
A sense that, I mean, Warhammer is a transactional universe. What it takes with one hand, it gives with another, and the opposite. So if you get a lot of gifts, and then you lose something too. And the Emperor is, I guess, the most extreme example of that. What's left of his humanity by the time he's done all these things?
Mm.
And the conversation that you mentioned between Malcador, who knows better than anyone, and Valdor, they're sort of speculating: is he losing his humanity? Is it going to all go,
Yeah.
or will he hang on to something? And does it matter? And how do you feel about that? And Valdor's like a sort of smaller example of that. He's never had that level of humanity in the way that some of the human characters in the book really do.
Yeah. Oh, I love it so much. I mean, I'd written down a question. I thought it might be a bit silly. It said, what were your thoughts on the Emperor? Benign dictator, bad dad, or savior of humankind? But
yeah. I mean, that's a brilliant question. It's not silly at all, because that's the whole conundrum, isn't it? And
yeah.
I think people are going to have. I mean, I occasionally sort of see or get involved in these kind of debates, and I think, in a way, it's a disappointing answer, because it feels like it's a cop out, but it should be all of those things, and
Yeah.
it might be all this at different times. I really, any depiction of the Emperor, whether it's from a distance or whether it's from slightly closer, should basically be leaving the reader thinking, I just don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's all those things. I mean, yeah, it's the core of Warhammer as well, because we know that the Imperium in 40k is a disaster. It's the worst regime. So clearly it hasn't gone as he intended. But is that his fault? Is it just the extension of his character? Was it always going to be like that, or was it could have gone otherwise? I don't know.
Well, I mean, everyone teases me because I just want him to be this lovable, lovely father god figure.
Yeah.
He comes back, he's going to save Fulgrim and get the demon out of Fulgrim and sort everything out. And of course, he's alive and he's magical and everything. So I get quite teased for that. But there were some really beautiful moments where we actually hear from the Emperor, which is like a real rare thing, because when he appears, and right at the beginning, this is a lovely trope that I love about Warhammer. You'll have these little prelogues, which are like, quite often they're vox coded things, messages. So we have S1 and S2, and I think it's the Emperor talking to Valdor, who's just woken up or just been created. And there was a great little saying in here. So the Emperor says, in the days to come, information and data may be all that I can give you. I can already feel it creeping up. You pay a price for all things, and this is mine. I will become less than human. And then Valdor says, less than. And then the Emperor says, and more. There was a saying, an old one, no such thing as a free lunch. You make one bargain become stronger, you make another become weaker. It applies to mortals, it applies to gods. Not that I intend to become one. And I was like, wow, that's on page 2 of the story.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my goodness, I kind of lost my mind. But yeah, that's the trade-off that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes I can't believe what stuff gets through editorial. I mean, I'm very lucky that because it's not often you get the chance to. I mean, people should absolutely not tease you for your view of the Emperor. I think it's a really important perspective. I think there is because Warhammer is this grimdark setting and everything's compromised. I think sometimes there's a tendency just to assume that the absolute worst perspective on someone must be the more serious one, the one that is the most accurate, the one that the law, and it's not always true. And I think if you lose that ambiguity about characters and lose the idea that the Emperor must have had something interesting going on, must have had something good in mind, then the whole setting becomes almost pointless, I think, sometimes. So he's going to be a complex character, and I think we've got to hang on to that sense that there's something interesting about what his vision is for the universe, whether or not it's one we agree with, or whether we think it could still come around and be or whether we think it's failed. There must be something that it was compelling to lots of people about it. Otherwise, it's just not, there's no point. So I think, it's great to have your perspective on the Emperor. And I think you should hang on to that in the face of stay firm. But no, I mean, certainly that passage at the beginning captures my view on things, which is that I think, that whenever you take on chaos, or whenever you take on something as bastards that you're going to be damaged by it, and you're going
Mm.
to even if you started with intentions, you're going to lose a lot on the way. And I
Yeah.
think people like the Emperor, in that sort of passage which we talked, alluded it very heavily, it's him, or Valdor, or even Space Marines. A lot of them go into this knowing that they're going to lose, and their heroism, to the extent there's heroism in the Imperium, is
Mm.
that it's like, I know that I'm going to be becoming partly monstrous by doing this. But
Yeah.
I've looked at the odds, I've looked at the situation, I still think it's a bargain worth making. So they go into it with their eyes open. And that, for me, because it is a very dark universe and there's lots of really bad things that happen on both sides, that's the kind of the core of heroism. And that works on the traitor side as well. There are some traitors, people like Lorgar, in
Mm.
particular, they look at the galaxy as it is and they say, this is my view of how things are. I've got to do this because this is the thing that is the most honest response, or the one
Yeah.
I, and they've got a point sometimes. And if it's written well, then readers will come out thinking, yeah, he did have a point.
Yeah.
Even if he's
Yeah.
not right, or whatever. Yeah.
No, the power of the writers, it really turns me, I'm like, I love this one. Oh, no, no, but this one, I feel so, I mean, I can't believe Graham McNeil made me feel sorry for Fulgrim.
Yeah.
Really big bastard. But no, the other thing is I sense there's so much joy with Black Library authors when they can sneak stuff in that's
Yeah.
really like lore affecting. So yeah, there's a little joy. And I think the Black Library is quite respectful in that it does let the writers kind of pop in little bits. It's not like a blanket ban on.
No, no. I mean, they're very. It's always a tightrope because I think the law really matters,
Yeah,
and being respectful of the law matters. I mean, I suppose my view is, and people would have different views, is that I feel very strongly about the spirit of the law
yeah,
and the spirit of Warhammer being a unique thing. I feel slightly less strongly about the letter of the law. Not in all, it's obviously important to do things by the letter of the law if you can, but if there's a way of the spirit of the law in the story coming out, and actually you have to use the wrong kind of bolter in order to get there, then I think there's
yeah,
part of me that thinks that's absolutely fine. And there are lots of people feel differently. There's the actual kind of the way the text has been written in the past is really important. So people do vary a little bit, but
yeah,
I'd rather read a book that got a few details wrong, but actually understood Warhammer and
yeah.
understood why it's interesting and what are the core themes. So that, for me, that's the right way around.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. And also in my experience, fans often they will decide what they want to see as canon. So
Yeah,
some of them are like, well, the codex says this, so I'm sticking with that. And others will be like, well, actually this book came out, so we're gonna switch to
yeah,
this. So yeah, it's a collaborative thing, I think. Everybody's different perspectives. Yeah.
very
Um
much so.
and then this was the first time I ever experienced Thunder Warriors.
Mm.
I had no clue about them. Legio Categis, I think it's pronounced.
Yeah, well, I think that's something I came up with possibly, which
That's
is just
amazing. And their Primarch Ushatan that was described as looking like the ghost of all murders. Such a great description, and you could just imagine this. And I mean, again, they're horrible, thuggish, nasty people, and you end up feeling so sorry for them. So Thunder Warriors was a Chris Wraight kind of something you pulled from your mind.
well, the Thunder Warriors have been in the background for a long time, and they've actually popped up in some of the heresy books. There's one of Graham McNeil's book called The Outcast Dead, which is set on Terra a bit later on.
Mm, okay.
Thunder Warriors in that, and there are Thunder Warriors here and there in the background, and they're often talked about. And they were the precursors to the Space Marines. They were the sort of the armies the Emperor used to conquer Terra, and famously they stopped being a thing. And there's a bit of
Mm,
mystery as to how that happened. And some of that is in Valdor, where they talk, and the whole of Canterbury's kind of worry is why have we just pushed that under the carpet? That
yeah.
they at one point they were the really important thing, and everyone was they were the heroes of humanity, and now they're all gone and no one seems to mind. And you're right about them. They're sort of, I guess, yeah, the Emperor is this kind of quite ruthless figure, and it's like he will create tools for the job at hand, and
Yeah.
he will make and all. And the other thing, I guess, is that at that time in history, the resources are very limited. He doesn't have a big galaxy-spanning empire.
Yeah.
He has this bit of Terra which he controls, and so you're using what you can, what's to hand, and you're using things that are appropriate to what you've got ahead of you. But what the Thunder Warriors had, certainly in the way I told it, but they had a lot more of the humanity as well as some of the. So they had some of the good parts of humanity and some of the bad parts of humanity, but they're much more human and much more rounded than Space Marines. They're certainly more human than custodians. And you get that hopefully with someone like Ushatan, who, even when he's losing, he's actually sorry for Valdor. It's like kind of, well, I've lived. I've seen.
Yes.
It is a bit like the end of Blade Runner. I've seen things people would not
Yeah.
believe, and if you did, you wouldn't even respond to them the way I did. So
Yeah.
so again, it's like all these things. The thing I find interesting about them is that they're nuanced. They've got these levels of, on the one hand, you can be appalled by what they do.
Mm.
You also be interested in their perspective, and even when you might not be rooting for them, because they're interesting, and even if you're not rooting for them, you can, so it's that. I think Warhammer does it better than I think a lot of settings do. That kind of sense, it's really complicated and morally compromised, and I guess as writers, we've got to try and lean into that as much as possible.
Mm. But no, thank you for the Blade Runner comparison, the poor replicants. Yeah, I mean, there were so many. It felt so real world. Even talking about the resources are limited, and people hadn't seen like plasteel before. It's all on the verge of this big switch, and yeah, I thought that was a bit of reuse, recycling.
Yeah.
And also, this is the first appearance of Space Marines with the Angels of Death. And they're all new, they're factory made. So now this is the way forward. This is the future. That must have been quite exciting to write. Their first ever, they emerge. And I was like, and then, in the book it says, that the symbol 1 was on their shoulders. And I was like, so how did that feel, like bringing them out and like taking the curtain away? Ta-da, Space Marines are here.
Oh, yeah, amazing. I mean, interestingly, that I think certainly since the book has been written, there's a bit of haziness about when Space Marines get introduced to the setting, and it's one of the many occasions where this early lore is a bit confused. So, I mean, I think at the time I wrote it, certainly the time the first draft went in, that was the first time the Space Marines. I think it's now a bit more complicated, but as a scene in the book, amazing to write the Space Marines kind of turning up and not people not knowing what they are. That's the other thing, that they're on the battlefield and they recognize these are terrifying things, but they don't know exactly what they are. And so even Valdor, he knows what they're meant to be, but no one's actually fought alongside them. They haven't got that weight of history behind them. These are the new guys. What are they going to do? What's the Emperor going to do with them? And so, no, yes, the idea is that either they're the very first time or it's one of the early deployments of Space Marines, and so it's an unfamiliar world. And it's Space Marines going up against Thunder Warriors. These are essentially the replacements, kind of cleaning up the mess of the previous ages. And again, it's that whole moral kind of grayness about it. Should you even be rooting for them? They're just necessary, or they're a false step. But no, brilliant to write them. And it's, from memory, the idea was that they come through the battlefield, and then their helm lenses are visible, and it's like this is an iconic look for a Space Marine coming into battle, and you see their helm. It's the first time anyone's seen it.
I thought it worked brilliantly as well with the geography of the setting. It's like this mountainous range, and conditions aren't great, and then this all emerged, and it felt so iconic. The beginning of a new epoch, and up in the Himalayas, it kind of all coincided. It was the perfect amount of space opera. It was just wonderful.
Oh, great! I'm glad. Yeah, that's great to hear.
It's quite hard to have in a universe like Warhammer. It's quite hard to have like big events because everything's a big event. You've got Titan robots and spaceships that can destroy planets. So I do think it's it's a great moment when you get those.
Yes, absolutely, and you're right. It's really hard sometimes to make these things feel kind of massive and important because so much is massive. And I certainly feel that when writing things like combat scenes or big battles, and you tend to find yourself reaching for the thesaurus and kind of like, I need to find more words for big, and you got to resist that and try and find ways to make this. Because so much is just this, and we're going back to what we were talking about, inspirations for things. For me, I'm quite a visual writer, and I think that, again, looking at the artwork was really what got me into loving the setting. And you had these extraordinary pictures of wild kind of battles, which are beyond really possibility. They're just these intensely kind of visceral scenes, and it's hard to convey that in writing because if you really just overload the writing to try and get to that, it can make it actually have the opposite effect.
Mm.
And so you're trying to learn. So I talked to Dan Abnett about these kind of things, and he's brilliant at that. He's got an amazing talent for zooming in and out of combat. So one moment you'll be watching Titans coming over the hill, and then you'll shift to a scene of an Imperial Guardsman lying in a puddle, thinking, "Oh my goodness, there's Titans coming over the hill." And that is what you need to kind of ground you in that. Otherwise, it's all massive and it's all sort of overplayed. But yeah, I mean, things like Space Marines popping out for the first time. No, that's an incredible thing.
Yeah.
And it has its own weight. And I suppose the other thing is you've got to be really careful with those things, because if you overdid them, then they'd stop being kind of interesting and they'd stop being important. And we had that all the time in the Heresy. There was always this temptation for like, this was the first time this particular weapon was seen on the battlefield, and you could do that too much. But if you do it rarely, it's great. It's great fun to see it.
Yeah. No, I loved it. And I can, now you're saying you're a visual kind of thinker, I felt that really showed. There were lots of tiny little details, like, the appearance of Astartes, for instance, or just tiny things people were doing as they were talking, or, I could see so much, when they discovered all the empty Primarch pods. It all felt so, visceral, so maybe that's your visual coming through your words. But yeah, I thought that was, even in all the kerfuffle, and you could really clearly picture where you were. So yeah, sorry, I do that sometimes. I just say what I like about the books.
No, well, it's lovely to hear.
Yeah. So and here's another thing I never knew. I did not know. I thought Astartes were called Astartes because they come from the stars. Something like this. And it's Amara Astarte, mum of Primarchs. Who knew? I know it's not like that in my head. They could have been a happy family. But and the heartbreak that Amar, was conflicted. Like, she was plucked from all these humans across the world and nurtured by the Emperor, who gave her access to all these gene experiment resources. And then she's thinking, they're mine, these are my creations. But then she's also thinking, how much of me has the Emperor sculpted with his powers? And I found her such an interesting, complex character, but I knew nothing before her of this. And then I was so, is she really dead? Because that's quite a cool, sorry, losing words, but to have that kind of character who was so close to the Emperor, trained and brought up, and had a hand in the Primarch creation, that was astonishing. So it is Astartes in the lore, or was that another creation? And
no, she was an invention for the book, and I was really worried about it.
Were you?
Yeah, no, well, very much so, because it's one of those things. I mean, so a lot of the time when you're trying to come up with, so you got Adeptus Astartes, this iconic name for Space Marines, and there's also a bit of haziness about what that means, where it came from. And this was an opportunity to here's an obvious route for that. And so some of the time you think, well, will people like that? Will people hate that? Will that be a terrible thing? Will that devalue Adeptus Astartes? Will that people think, oh, it's just named after someone who made them? Or will people find it interesting and compelling? So when you come up with that kind of stuff, obviously it goes through editorial and people can let you know if it's not going to work. But that was a genuine addition to the lore. It's like, kind of, would it be interesting if what Adeptus Astartes really was a reference to one of their creators? And so it was new for Valdor, and I hope people like it. And she was hopefully an interesting character, that she was one of the people that was most involved with creating them as they are.
Yeah.
Or the gene scientists that worked there. And since Valdor came out, we got some other names of people who also kind of were involved in that, all contributing something else. But there's this I suppose there is this idea, it's like a maternal thing. It's like, kind of, what have I created? Do I love my children anymore? And part of that is because she sees the Primarchs being scattered or being taken away, she thinks has happened. And she's also aware of this troubled history with the Emperor's creations. It's like, kind of, what if I'm making something that's worse than the problem they're designed to solve?
Yeah.
I think, it's also true that they're all under these extreme conditions all the time. So it's not so much that what they think about is right. It's maybe she just kind of, the stress cracked her. Maybe she thought, I can no longer make decisions like this because I've worked so hard to produce these things, and now I can't see clearly anymore. So we don't really know what she felt, and obviously felt strongly enough to try and do something about it. Is she dead? I don't know.
Never
I
know.
genuinely, I think I thought she was at the end of the book, but who knows? These things, people have a life beyond.
Yeah, I'm always thinking they must be coming back, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, and I just have
Yeah,
to learn to live with it. I noticed someone on the internet had said in Hindi the name Amar, because she's called Amar Astartes,
she is. Yes.
means not dead or immortal in
Is
Hindi.
that,
So I don't know if I was
I
like,
wish I could say that in my very carefully worked out way. Of course, that's what it meant. I'm afraid not. No, I don't remember exactly. Sometimes there's significance in names, and most of the time there isn't. I remember one time a character, I don't even remember which one, that I wrote for a heresy book years ago. Someone had done an analysis of the name and it came up with this extraordinary backstory for them based on what it meant in
wow.
some mythology. And of course, it was just, it sounded good. So, it doesn't really.
It does sound good. That's fine. I mean, yeah, I mean, I love finding these little things and then making up my own stories in my head. So I'm sure half the internet's doing that too. So I don't feel
Yeah,
alone. So that's good. No, I thought she was a great character, and I felt it was in a little way as a female in the hobby. I'm so lucky. I've mostly met wonderful people, but sometimes I get some quite sharp comments, and I'm like,
yeah,
crikey, blimey. And I just thought it was a really beautiful, very, very Warhammer subversive bit of writing to have a woman involved with the creation right from the beginning.
yeah.
It wasn't like, a massive flag or anything. It was just this very gentle, oh, and yes, Amara Astartes was involved. And I thought that as a female reader, I quite liked that. I really,
Yeah, no, I'm glad about that because I think that, I mean, obviously, when you're writing books with Space Marines in, who certainly
yeah,
compared to all men, sometimes you look at your cast list and think, there are no women in this,
yeah,
and then it's it can actually be surprisingly difficult to get around that because we sometimes joke about it that you find the stories, but all the planetary governors, all the captains of starships are all women because we just had to have some balance,
yeah,
otherwise it was ridiculous.
yeah,
And so actually, it is a thing to think about. I mean, obviously, Warhammer was created a long time ago by men in a time when people were probably less sensitive to making
yeah,
things more open, and trying to broaden the universe and broaden the appeal and make it more realistic. Because obviously, in the far future, it would be crazy if
mm,
we were sort of sticking to some of the sort of I think the unconscious just habits that people when they were creating it did do. So I'm glad that characters like Astarte and Kandawari and some of the heresy books that it's been great. So one of my long running series in the heresy is the White Scars, who are a legion that I've sort of written about a lot. And one of the key characters there is someone called Ilia Revalian, who is a general in the Imperial Army who's a woman who gets sort of seconded to them. And she ends up getting drawn into their culture and becoming one of their most trusted advisors. And her arc throughout those books is one of the longest character arcs I think I've written, one of the ones I'm fondest of. Um, and so I think, having the opportunity to think more broadly than just kind of Space Marines advancing across the field
mm,
and everything is really important. I'm sorry that you get some of that feedback that you do because it's a shame that still happens. But I think broadening,
yeah.
horizons is a good thing, and we should all
Uh,
be looking
I
about
mean,
it.
yeah, I mean, I went to Salute on the weekend and it was absolutely lovely. And I've been to Salute for a good few years, and I feel like there's definitely more people that look like me wandering about now. And I definitely feel very welcomed, and I really enjoy the hobby. And to a point, I do understand, like, if I look at who watches my videos, it gives you a breakdown, where people live and, whether they put themselves down as male or female. And people who watch my videos is like 96% male. So, I
Yeah,
understand. But it's just really lovely. I mean, I think when it's done just quite naturally, it flows.
yeah,
It's not jarring, and yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed that Candywire uh, was not like a typical action movie woman.
mm,
She was kind of a little bit rotund, and she was like, "God, I'm really out of, I need to exercise more," and it just felt very real, and yeah, I thought she was a great heroine. So yeah, really enjoyed her.
yeah. I do wonder what happened to her. I hope whatever it was, I hope it was all right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we know everyone's always all right in the grimdark. It will be fine, Chris. Um, so yeah, there was, and then the lovely bit where Valda lets Kandawai go, and she says to him, "How are you different from all the others except in power?" And he looks down at her with, and this is beautiful because I've just realised he looked at Kandahar with somber eyes, letting the sleep run down his face. There we go, tears of the,
That's right. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
there you go, tears in the rain. Because we are a necessity, he said grimly, we stand between ignorance and annihilation. To prevent the latter, we enforce the former. It's a bitter draught and one you've been schooled to hate, but it must be swallowed. And I guess that's the whole conflict with the emperor knowing about what is to come. And
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think so. One of the big themes in the heresy books as well is the idea of ignorance. And there's this thing called the imperial truth, the idea that at the beginning of the Great Crusade, the emperor keeps the knowledge of chaos from the Imperium. And the
Yes.
real truth is there are no gods, there are no demons. It's a world of rationality, and it's a secular Imperium. And over the course of the heresy, people begin to realize, at least on the surface, that's not true. You know, that there
Yeah.
are gods, there are demons. Why did you lie about that? Why did you say that? And that sort of line from Valdor is exactly why. That you know, there is a judgment made. This is so dangerous, we cannot let people know. And so there's an open question: was that a good decision? Should people have known? Would that have stopped everything going wrong in the heresy if they'd been more open about the way the universe is? Or were they right? Would it have been a disaster if chaos had been? And so that right from the start, there's this idea that we're going to keep secrets. We think it's necessary. We've got reasons for what we do. And we're just going to have to hope it works. And it's up to the reader to decide whether that's a good strategy, whether it's an appalling strategy, whether it's something that you can morally defend. I mean, even if it was going to end in tears, is it morally right to hold things back from the people that you're claiming to be kind of saving from the evil baddies? And I think as long as these questions remain open, there's endless debate for people.
Yeah. I mean,
but what isn't a debate is that Valdor does genuinely believe it. They're not lying about this themselves. I mean, he's completely down the line on this. We cannot. I'm quite prepared to shunt these very impressive characters like Kandahar out of place, because if we let them do what they want to do for all the right reasons, then they're going to destroy everything. And that's his. That's what he thinks.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is a bitter pill, but I always admire how the story Valdor is basically about this attempted coup and the introduction of the Space Marines. But in those short conversations, we get to see the macrocosm of the universe and the theory behind it all, which is quite helpful for like new people to the universe. So I really enjoyed that bit as well. And then the other thing that I never knew before I read this book is that the emperor needs to go to the moon because there's gene technology on the moon. So I was like, wow, what's happening here? And, that's the next thing they're all off to do. And the last time I was on the moon with Warhammer was Heresy. I think it was Flight of the Eisenstein. So, I mean, I'm like, oh, all the pieces are coming together now and everything. So I guess, did you know you had this little time and space and that was going to be your ending of Valdor?
That's a really good question. So the bit about Luna having these, what they call gene looms, they have these, that's the way they accelerate the Space Marine Legion production. There are this culture called the Seleni who live on Luna.
Who probably don't live for long, do they? I'm imagining.
Well,
no.
There's quite a lot about it. But so at the time, so there is this sort of rival empire on Luna, and one of the things they can do is they're incredibly clever at manipulating genes, and they mass produce the Space Marines. Now, did I know at the time? So I think so one of the things that happened in Valdor is that they deliberately let Astarte blow up the facility.
Yes.
In order to kind of, it's like a sort of like, now our enemies will assume that we failed, and of course they've moved all the technology up to Luna, and I think that came into the synopsis quite late in the day. I think that was, we were trying to think of satisfying ways to resolve things, and just the fact that we knew at some point that had to happen.
Yeah,
was this sort of straight, and at the same time, the conquest of Luna is quite an important thing for the early Imperium. It's where the Lunar Wolves get their name. This Horus's Legion. And so sort of tying all this series of kind of really important early events together. So it was all part of a sort of a sequence. So it wasn't just the Emperor was responding to events. This was actually all kind of quite well engineered, that we're going to move facility and then we're going to take advantage of that to create this kind of diversion where, even though it looks like everything's gone wrong on Terra, actually this is all part of the plan. And I think that was something that, because again, as I was saying earlier, a lot of this law was being written at the time this book was being written, so it was a bit of a moving target. I can't remember if that particular element had either been solid or was changing. But it did seem like a good opportunity to kind of kind of bring all this stuff together and just we're never going to see that. It's not in this book, but we can just allude to the fact that's where the Emperor is. I think in the book, a few people say, "Well, where is the Emperor? Why isn't he here?" Given that all this
Yeah.
is going on, and then you find out at the end he's not just been wandering around. They're doing the other important stuff that was going on too.
Yeah, I thought it was great because now obviously I'm like, well, now I have to find the book that says what happens on the moon. So
Yeah,
it just keeps you going. It's like a life
yeah.
sentence. But I can't believe we've been talking for nearly an hour. But
Oh, nice.
no, yeah, I've got some more questions about you because obviously I was doing a little bit of research, and you've written in quite a few different. Sorry, I always do this. I run out of time because I'm too excited.
That's no problem.
So basically, you've written Warhammer Fantasy, you've written 40K, you've written Heresy, and you've also written something called Warhammer Crime,
Oh
which
yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't heard of. And one of my favorite authors is I'm going to forget his name. I love those very old books. The detective's called Philip Marlowe.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
the,
no, blimey.
the Long Goodbye, and
Yeah, that's
and
my mind's gone blank as well, but I know exactly what you mean. The kind of noir. Yeah.
yeah. What's it like writing a Warhammer crime novel? How do you go about that? And how easy is it to write a mystery that has to be revealed at the end?
Oh, it's brilliant. I loved writing. I loved it. I love Bloodlines. Because partly because it was right at the other end of the spectrum from some of the big. So
Hmm.
there's Warhammer's interesting because it has this sort of big picture, had the sort of blockbuster movie style storylines where you have
Yeah.
big armies, big navies clashing, and then at the other end there's this enormous galaxy, lots and lots of planets where nobody sees any of this, and they live. So one of the lovely things about world building for the Warhammer Crime novel is that it's set in this city, which is a huge city on this planet, which nobody's ever heard of. It's not important. It doesn't have any role in the big top level stories. The way I told the story, certainly, a lot of the inhabitants of this world, they don't even believe Xenos exists because they've never seen one. They just think they're, or at least some of the characters don't think they're real. They don't know anything about chaos because that's completely forbidden. They're what they're told, and when they go to the cathedral where they is the stories of the way the universe works, all the way from the point of view of the Imperium. So they'll tell them about angels and demons, but they won't know anything about. They don't really know about traitor Primarchs. They'll know that the great 9 Primarchs of the past were our defenders, but they won't know anything about the others because that will all have
Yeah.
been hushed up. And so they live their lives very much like we live our lives, but just in this very grim setting. It's a much harder world. But
Mm.
they're not space marines, they're not superhuman. So the protagonist is a guy called Zidorov. He's married, he has a daughter, and they're all characters in the book, and they all have the kind of relationships with each other that we would have. And so there are some of the classic tropes about crime, like it's hard to actually manage a family when you're also in a very dangerous, difficult job, and you come home and you're knackered, and you kind of. So all of that's still there as it is in the real world, but there are the Warhammery things too. So there are the strange relationships with technology. It's this kind of decaying civilization. There's all these strange stories about how the planet was colonized that no one really understands anymore. And you do get hints of an outside universe. So one of the things about the plot is that the space traffic that brings all the goods and supplies has been disrupted. Nobody knows why. And a kind of a reader who knows about 40K will probably think, well,
Mm.
this must be the Great Rift. It's knocked out all the
Oh,
warplanes. It's never said in the book because no one has got anywhere
yeah.
close to understanding that stuff. And so that was a lovely thing. So, because exactly the opposite from Valdor, where they're talking about the core. Valdor knows as much as anyone in the Imperium does about the universe, and then you've got poor like Didorov sitting there thinking like, I don't know if aliens are real. I don't know any of this stuff. I'm just here to kind of fight crime and solve mysteries,
Yeah.
and to write a crime. Like, it's a great departure for me. I had to learn a lot. I read a lot of some of the crime stories that I enjoy. And you're right, Philip Marlowe, that kind of thing was a big inspiration. It had, and again, Blade Runner too. That idea that it was this kind of noirish future kind of setting where everything's very run down. It rains all the time,
Yeah.
and they just try and make the best of their very difficult lives. So it was great fun.
Well, I'm really excited to learn about them because I was introduced to um, Warhammer through Xenos because my
Mm,
friend Ian thought, well, there's a bit of a, it's an inquisitor going to do an investigation. I know
yeah.
she would probably come in through that investigation. So I'll definitely have to read these books now. Um, but
Oh, I'd
you,
love to know what you think because I think just that sense of, and Xenos is a great, that's a great book, but it's also a great example of that kind of thing. It's the kind of mystery hunting down. But
yeah,
even Xenos is is pretty top level. Inquisitors are a big deal. There aren't very many of them. Whereas these guys, there's billions of them. So literally nobody cares if you don't make it out the other end. So, and they were quite aware of that.
Well, I definitely will look it up. And do you have like a favorite? This is a really unfair question, but do you prefer sci-fi or fantasy? Like, where do you feel most comfortable in the Warhammer oeuvre? Like when
in terms of writing, or
yeah.
I mean, I think of myself now as a 40k writer. I've got to say, I think that's probably so. That's the setting that I read when I was before I was a part of the Black Library team.
Yeah.
And I mean, the bit in fantasy I love was the Empire, which was this very brilliant kind of setting, and it's a very non-standard fantasy setting. So almost all the fantasy books I wrote were set in the Empire, despite the High Elves being my first sort of shot at it. And that was where I felt most at home in fantasy. But now I think it's a long time since I wrote a fantasy book, so I think I'm probably 40k is probably where I spend most of my time.
You're a space boy. And what if you had to play a legion? What would you choose?
A legion. See, if we're going to play a faction, I'd probably go for something like Solar Auxilia, because I think their look is so amazing. These kind of like non-Space Marine fighters. If it was going to be a legion,
I bet everyone
probably,
else.
It's a difficult. Probably Dark Angel, I think. I mean,
interesting.
Yeah, they're so interested. They love their aesthetic. That's in some ways it's the core Warhammer aesthetic. There are lots of candidates for that, but they're kind of the kind of knightly aspect of it, and the fact that they, certainly in the Heresy period, they're the first lead, and they're the archetype for all the rest, and they end up being so sort of obsessed with secrecy and all that kind of thing. That's pretty core Warhammer for me. I think it'd probably be them.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, I'm very pleased that you like elves, because my friend Ian is a dwarf person. So the more elf people I can meet, the better. But thank you so much for joining me today. I really loved the book, and thank you so much for spending time with me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much.
No worries. Okay. So I'll do the stop recording now.
It's a time of strife down on terror through the eyes of Candlewood. Someone please go call for the Emperor. Valdor is in charge.